We're not crazy, the system is. Tune in to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health. Wednesdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Pacifica affiliate WXOJLP-FM 103.3 Valley Free Radio. Produced by Freedom Center and the Icarus Project, streaming live, podcasting, and archived at madnessradio.net. And thanks for tuning in to Madness Radio. This is your host, Will Hall. And today we are doing a show on youth and suicide. Today joining us from Washington, D.C. is Leah Harris. And one of the reasons that I wanted to have Leah on the show today is that this is actually the kickoff for a tour that the Icarus Project is going to be doing of a number of different cities in the South and the Midwest. We're actually going to be in Blacksburg, Virginia at Virginia Tech on Monday, and then we'll also be in a number of different cities, Indianapolis, Chicago, Minneapolis, Asheville, and we are going to be talking on college campuses, and suicide's going to be a topic that's going to come up. So you'll be hearing more about the Icarus Mad Gifts Week tour in some of the upcoming shows here on Madness Radio. I'm hoping to get some audio from the tour and have it be part of the radio show. So I'd like to introduce Leah now. I'll read her bio. Leah Harris is an activist, writer, daughter of a mother and father who were both labeled as mentally ill, and is herself a survivor of psychiatric abuse as a child and teen. Leah is a board member of NARPA, the National Association for Rights Protection and Advocacy, and for Mental Disability Rights International. She is a past chair of the Protection and Advocacy for Individuals with Mental Illness Advisory Council. Her writings on mental health issues have been published in New York City Voices, a consumer journal for mental health advocacy, adbusters.org, Off Our Backs, a feminist news journal, the Icarus Project, and Street Spirit. Leah was a participant and editor of Mind Freedom Support Coalition International Oral History Project, and she is currently working on a memoir about her experiences in the mental health system. Leah lives in Washington, D.C. So welcome to Madness Radio, Leah.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Will.
Yeah, I'm really glad to have you on the show. It's been we've been wanting to have you on the show for a while. I'm glad it finally got a chance to happen.
Yeah, me too.
So you were actually one of the keynote speakers at the Big Alternatives Conference that I was at with a number of folks from the Freedom Center at St. Louis, Missouri, a couple of weeks ago, and there were about 800 people from around the country who do peer advocacy and peer counseling. And I kind of just I'm really excited to have you just read the poem that you read at the conference. Just kind of start off that way. How does that sound?
That sounds good. This is a poem called Teenage Mental Patient. I want to tell you what it's like to be a teenage mental patient, to have your every movement scrutinized, your every uttered word analyzed, then to be accused of paranoia when you point this out. This is what I learned inside. In order to get out, you have to hide how you feel. You have to lie until you don't even feel real. It's torture, and after enough pain, you learn to play the game, walk the walk, talk the talk, smile and take your meds, and every morning make your bed. You can always tell the new admits, wild-eyed and still high on coke, crack, Zyprex, and Prozac, jacked up on speed, still bleeding from their last botched suicide attempt, gauzy white bandages encircling fragile, wounded wrists. I saw Lil Brazy, 14-year-old South Central gangsta girl, so engulfed with anger and indignation at her unjust incarceration. It took 2 grown women and men to subdue her. They held her down, bruising her brown skin purple, shot her up like an animal, like the unreachable wounded animal they considered her to be. Oak Grove Institute was a mad warehouse for troublesome kids of all sorts. Jason was 10, told adults to fuck off, for which they labeled him with Tourette's. Jack was a cross-dressing Nirvana fan. Andy's mother hit him. He hit her back and was labeled oppositional. Kizzy and Lil Brazy were self-identified hood rats. Marie's crime was a developmental disability. Sue idolized Michael Jackson obsessively. Sarah Lynn had Satan worshippers for parents. Sue and Sarah Lynn were lovers, for which they were put on 20-foot restriction, because you ain't allowed to love no one in there. Yeah, they look down on that in there, and you certainly aren't allowed to be queer. And me, I was a majorly depressed, severely emotionally disturbed, borderline personality disorder, obsessively compulsive, medium to high suicide risk with bipolar tendencies, who wore too much eyeliner and fishnet stockings, wrote poetry that didn't make sense to them, skipped school sometimes, and dreamed of being editor-in-chief of my high school paper before they locked me up. The reigning philosophy is that youth is pathology, because so-called crazy kids aren't allowed to be kids. You are forced to be patients. You are drugged, undereducated, over-therapized, psychiatrized, and victimized. And they never mention the word trauma, because here's the explanation for your life's drama. Your brain is broken, and we'll fix it with institutional food, lack of sunlight and fresh air, and we'll fix it with drugs. We'll fix it all with drugs. I remember us crazy girls, wild with boredom and rage, scraping anarchy symbols into our skin with an eraser, the only weapon we possessed, trying to erase the skin that held us in, watching scab turn into scar, growing bitter and dying inside, watching the days go by. We were released, all of us, one by one, sentences determined by our insurance policies and our acting abilities, sent back to the people, institution, society that oppressed us, to the adults who abused us in the first place out of their own fear, ignorance, and pain. And so we'd soon end up on the back wards again, hanging on to one another to survive, trying to keep alive some shreds of hope in our hearts, grasping on to fading dreams as our spirits slowly came apart at the seams. And that's what it's like to be a teenage mental patient.
Leah, you know, I've heard that. I've heard you do that poem probably 3 or 4 times now, and it's just really touches me. I mean, thank you so much for having the courage, just because I think it's the anger and the truth really of the abuse, and this is just so much torment that teenagers go through and you went through, and it really touches my own experiences having been in the system. So I want to thank you for reading that for us on Madness Radio. And
thank you, everyone, for listening.
Yeah. Well, listen, I was thinking maybe you could tell us now a little bit about the background. I mean, how did you end up being a teenage mental patient, being locked up, and what is it that brought you into the system?
Well, I guess it's sort of hard to talk about my experience without talking about my parents' experience, as you touched on when you read my bio, that, you know, I'm the daughter of, you know, 2 quote-unquote crazy people. And that has such a powerful legacy. I always grew up with this enormous fear of becoming like my parents, because I saw the way their lives unfolded, this idea of, you know, mental illness really signaling the death, I think, of everything that one cares about. That's what I saw. I saw all of their dreams, you know, slowly slipping away over time, and I ended up being taken away from my mother when I was 5.5, because, you know, here she is, a woman diagnosed with schizophrenia, you know, living on the poverty level, absolutely no support, single mom, you know, I mean, and she just, you know, wasn't able to raise me on her own. And so I was, you know, I went to live with the grandmother who actually had sort of had my mother institutionalized. So, of course, she was also looking for psychiatric solutions for me. And I remember the first time when I was 7 years old, I started to ask questions about, you know, kind of existential questions. Why was I born? Why was I, you know, why am I here? You know, the questions that the great philosophers have asked, you know, over the centuries. And I was, you know, packed off to a psychiatrist for asking those questions. And I overheard a conversation between a psychiatrist and my grandmother, and she said, well, you know, with her history, she has more than a 50% chance of becoming severely mentally ill.
You mean with
and,
your,
you know, yeah, at the
family.
age of 7, I didn't exactly understand what that meant, but I knew it was really bad.
So they were basically saying that, oh, because your parents are this way, that you're going to be this way, basically.
Yeah, it's sort of this genetic determinism that's very scary when I think about it now, because it really has no scientific basis, but it's sort of treated as scientific fact. And so I internalized that. And that eventually became somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And when I hit puberty, I sort of really started to go through a lot of emotional distress, a lot of it related to unresolved trauma from the things my mom and I went through when I was really young, when we were both very vulnerable. And none of that was ever addressed, ever, never talked about. And so my family took me to a psychiatrist. This was right after Prozac came on the market. It was a brand new drug. I mean, they had no idea how it would affect, adults, much less children. And, I was immediately put on the drug, and you relate to this experience, Will. I mean, at first I just was, as high as one could be. I mean, I was just, my happiness was untouchable. I was floating around, not sleeping, just so high on life. And very soon after that, I just crashed. But I was still, I was agitated. I still had that intense energy, but I wasn't, happy anymore. I was just keyed up. And the insomnia got worse and worse, and then they gave me another drug to make me go to sleep at night. And that was when I started having thoughts of harming myself, which I hadn't had prior to going on the Prozac.
You had never been suicidal before taking the Prozac?
No, I mean, I was distressed. I guess you could call it, depression, whatever. I was definitely having some emotional stuff, but it didn't have that kind of agitated, kill yourself sort of quality to it. It was
that impulse, those impulses, that suicidal impulse.
Yeah, that was not a part of my experience until I went on the Prozac, and that was seen as a symptom of my worsening illness rather than an adverse reaction to the drug, which now I'm a textbook case for adverse reaction to Prozac. When I look back, and at it now and how quickly it all unfolded. So they increased the dosages of this drug that was hurting me. This is basically what happened.
Right, you're still complaining, so obviously you must need more drugs if you're still complaining, right?
Well, right, this is her underlying illness is worsening. That was like the mantra, underlying illness.
Right.
Underlying illness, and so it kind of went from, and I do always say this, that I know for some people self-injury is a coping mechanism. It doesn't necessarily mean that someone is suicidal, and a lot of times they get treated as if they are suicidal, which is really damaging. But for me, it was very intertwined. And so it wasn't long after I started self-injuring that I really actively was making attempts to take my life, which, of course, that's how I got, into the mental hospital for the first time. And after, of course, a completely dehumanizing experience in the emergency room where I was just treated like, a piece of meat. And so that was that cycle that kind of got set up where I just had this revolving door cycle of hospitalizations in my adolescence.
How long did this go on? Did this go on for years?
It went on until I was a bit over 18. It all started when I was 14.
Right, so you were on Prozac at age 14?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then they tried me on Prozac, and then Zoloft came out. I think it was in maybe 91. And then the last one I was on was Paxil. And then, other ones. But they sort of put me on every single SSRI that was on the market at that time. And always the same effect. And when I was on Paxil, I actually developed an obsession with knives, which is also now I've read is not uncommon. Sudden obsession with knives, and things like this that just kind of popped up.
So this went on for about 4 years that you were in and out of hospitals.
Yeah, it was really my whole adolescence. Whole adolescence.
And then how did you pull yourself out of this?
Well, it was interesting. One of my last hospitalizations, I was had just become a legal adult, and so they put me on the adult ward, and that experience really freaked me out because I saw my future, and I saw that I was going to end up just like my parents if I didn't do something. And I had already acquired this kind of what is called learned helplessness, where I felt like really dependent on the professionals to fix me. Yet I also really kind of resisted them at the same time. It was this weird dynamic. And at that point, I was in a really horrible group home, and so they discharged me from the hospital, and I was in this awful group home, and I was just like, this cannot be my future. And somehow, I don't know what it was, I just decided that I was no longer going to consume what they were offering. And it was almost, I guess you could call it like a moment of grace. I don't really know how to describe it now, but I, just kind of ate my pride, and I'm very lucky, even though my family has, we've had kind of a tumultuous relationship. They did agree to take me back from that group home and encouraged me to sort of get back into school, which was a really good thing for me because it sort of felt like, becoming part of a world that wasn't associated with my illness. And, so slowly, just like baby steps, I graduated from high school, which I had been really behind in that, and just kind of inched my way back. And I consider myself very lucky. They agreed to let me go off the psych drugs. I said, if anything happens, I swear I will go right back on them. And I just was able to, prove myself somehow. So I consider it a lot of luck and also family support at the time when I most needed it.
So, and now you are a writer, you're an advocate, you're very much involved in human rights organizing around mental health issues. When did you start getting involved in that part of it?
Well, it's actually a really funny story that I always love to tell, how that all came about. I was in grad school and, again, was having a lot of struggles. And for some bizarre reason, after being out of the system for quite a while, I sort of reached out to the University Counseling Center. I was really new in the area. I didn't have a good support system, good friends yet. And as soon as they heard my history, they're like, "You gotta go back. You're not medicated? What? You have to go back on meds, like now." And I said, no, I really don't. I did not have good experiences. I couldn't articulate why, but I just, And so the therapist said, "Well, you got to go get this book, Listening to Prozac by Peter Kramer, and that will really kind of help you understand why you need to, go back on, medication." And so I marched to the university bookstore, and they didn't have Listening to Prozac, but they had Talking Back to Prozac by Peter Breggin. And that moment, completely changed the course of my life. I picked it up, I read it in one sitting. I was like, oh my God, I can't believe that someone is articulating what I went through. For the first time, everything I read in there was like, yes, that happened to me. That's what I went through. And I had never been exposed to anything like that. And I wrote to Peter Breggin, and I said, "You're telling my story." And he wrote back and said, "Okay, you got to get in touch with there's a whole movement of people working on these issues." And that was in the year 2000. And so ever since then, this has really been what I've been dedicating my time to and my work.
Yeah, it sounds like you had a really close call with the system, and we're just kind of like luck and circumstances you're able to get out of it. And then you had another close call, and then things sort of turned around and went another direction for you.
Yeah, it's sort of been these interesting experiences of synchronicity that I can't entirely account for, but that have, I just feel like I've been very lucky to have those experiences.
Yeah, you mentioned grace, and I think about my own experience, and there were definitely some moments where I just got really lucky, and I think it could have gotten a lot worse for me if Providence hadn't intervened or fate hadn't intervened. And I definitely count myself very lucky. And so, you're someone who's, you've seen and lived with your parents, you've been through the system, you saw and heard all these voices of all these young people when you were in the hospitals, and now you've become an advocate, a national human rights advocate. And one of the reasons I invited you on the show today is that I want to really try and get at this question of suicide and how is it that society can really best respond. Suicide is, it's really something that it seems so common sense. It's like, suicide is a terrible thing. When people are suicidal, they need help. let's get them help. And then somehow the mental health system and the pharmaceutical companies have really gotten in there and twisted it around. And now we get into a situation where the danger of suicide is something that's used to inflict terrible abuses on people in the mental health system, just put them into horrible trauma and force people and restrain them and force drug them and lock them up in solitary confinement, all in the name of preventing suicide. And that's one of the things.
Well, I mean, it's really, we'll prevent you from killing yourself, even if it kills you. I mean, it's really like that.
And or as long as you're in the hospital, and then once you're out, I think they're actually Peter Stotsny, who's a psychiatrist in New York, actually has told me about some studies that were done that the suicide rate actually goes up among people who've been hospitalized. There's a correlation between a hospitalization experience and an increased risk for suicide. But it seems to be true that there's a tremendous mystery to suicide, that we know a few things, that men are more likely to actually commit suicide than women are, that people who have attempts of suicide are more likely to actually succeed than those who are on their first attempt at suicide. But in terms of actually being able to predict who is actually a risk for suicide, or who is actually going to commit suicide, or even how to best prevent suicide, there really isn't hard science. There really aren't simple and easy answers. Is that something you would agree with, or do you have a different sense of that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I completely agree that there truly are no easy answers. And I think, in our culture, there's just this attempt to really kind of suppress a real truthful dialogue about suicide. There's just so much terror and fear. So I think that's what we deal with, is just this total culture of fear about it.
And there's even a belief that, if we talk about it, it's somehow going to trigger it, or it's going to bring it up, or it's going to cause suicide. Or
I guess they talk about the copycat syndrome, that if we talk about it, then we're going to encourage other people to do it.
Yeah, which there is some truth to that, but that's really about how things are reported in the media in a kind of a tabloid, sensationalist way. That shouldn't be preventing people in communities or individuals or families or friends from talking about suicide. How do you think that those kinds of dialogues about suicide can actually be helpful? It seems to me that one of the things is like learning that, hey, the professionals don't have all the answers, and in fact sometimes are going to recommend treatments that are going to make things worse. That's one thing that we can learn from having dialogues about suicide.
Well, sure. And I think, really was that people like Peter Breggin, who were talking about, suicide as an adverse effect, what they call suicidality. I don't really like that word, but he was considered a quack and, on the fringe, really until the FDA was forced really to admit that, these drugs were causing people to be suicidal when they hadn't been before. And
you were part of the congressional hearings around that, is that right?
Well, it was myself and 60 families and individuals, just one of us, one after the other, testified. And I was really one of the few survivors of an attempt. It was mainly the family members who were survivors of young people who had taken their lives. So I think that's one really essential part of the dialogue that needs to happen, that is coming out, although, as you know, then there's sort of a backlash against it. There was this recent pseudo-study that said that, well, the suicide rate actually increased as antidepressant prescriptions decreased, which has been exposed to be, completely funded by industry. And there's some, really good evidence about that on the Alliance for Human Research Protection website.
Yeah, the ahrp.org is their website.
And the media just sort of picks up these studies that are authored by industry hacks and says, wow, the recent study shows, and
exactly.
And then whips up the hysteria.
It's just like the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is starting to come out, and then industry, the chemical pollution industry, the carbon industries, put out fake research and get it into the media and do PR campaigns trying to claim that the science is on their side, and the pharmaceutical companies are doing exactly the same thing. When did those hearings take place?
It was in February of 2004, And then later that year, oh no, I'm sorry, it was September of 2004, and then later that year, the FDA authorized what is called a black box warning, which is the strongest warning that can come with any drug before you pull it off the market about the suicide side effect. And they said under 18, although now I think they've extended it to 25. I'm not 100% sure about that, but they've been exploring this effect as it relates to adults, which makes sense to me, because what would happen when you all of a sudden turned 18 where, the effect would be different.
Well, I think it's important to mention that, there's definitely an increased risk of suicidality for many people associated with psychiatric drugs, but it's certainly not all people. And,
No.
Many people do feel, because obviously these are drugs and they change your brain chemistry, they change your bodies, and they have an effect. And sometimes people do feel that it helps them to cope by taking, whether it's antidepressants or anti-anxiety drugs. And so that's one option. But the problem seems to be that that's being pushed as the only option, and the dangers and sort of downside of the medications isn't being honestly explained to people. In fact, instead, this sounds like this was told to you that, oh, you have a broken brain, you have a genetic disease, and therefore you need to be on these medications, just like, a diabetic needs insulin. Although I think now that Zyprexa has been exposed to be causing diabetes, they're going to be using the diabetes analogy a lot less.
Maybe.
So, but is that what happened?
That one came back to bite them.
Yeah. Although Eli Lilly does sell diabetes medication. So, Leah, is that something that was told to you, the whole genetic disease thing?
Yeah. Oh, I remember from the earliest time, hearing from my psychiatrist this whole chemical imbalance theory. And I remember once, I don't know where this came from, but I sort of cornered the psychiatrist in when I was hospitalized and said, I want a test. I want a test that shows that I have what you say I have. And he just walked away.
Right. Couldn't quite produce it. Yeah.
There's no, I want to, I just said, give me some proof, give me some evidence that I have this thing, So, yeah, and as we know, they still cannot produce any evidence.
Even the pharmaceutical ads themselves are today's, if you actually read them carefully, they say the chemical imbalances are believed to cause depression or chemical, and they're forced to kind of, in the fine print, acknowledge that these are theories. So if you're just joining us, this is Madness Radio. I'm talking to Leah Harris, who is an activist, writer, and a mental health advocate who's joining us from Washington, D.C. So Leah, let's talk a little bit more about, I know that your own experience was that you were not actively suicidal until after taking psych drugs, but I know that you've done a lot of work in your writing groups and in your advocacy work with a lot of people who are struggling with suicide and who are trying to come up with good, humane policies for how do we as a society really start to prevent suicide. And I think one of the things that we talked about was a dialogue and getting some accurate information out there and not having the kind of tabloid, sensational soundbite approach. But what are some other ways that we could really honestly start to take a look at this issue and help people who are maybe facing suicide?
Yeah, and I think I should mention too that even after I went off the psych drugs, sort of well into my 20s, I would still have suicidal thoughts. So I know it wasn't 100% connected to the psych drugs. So I definitely can relate to having them. Without that.
Well, I think that's actually part of the dialogue too, is that I think a lot of us have suicidal thoughts and suicidal periods at one point. And I think
that's the thing, is that I don't really like the word stigma so much, because I think the word is actually stigmatizing, but just to sort of break down the sense of isolation, like, I'm the only one that feels this way, or what is wrong with me that I want to kill that's what I remember feeling like, God, I am so sick. Like, why do I feel? And if I had just heard, even from a professional, a lot of people feel this way, that would have done so much for me to just kind of lift me out of that sense of isolation and shame. So I think to just really acknowledge, and so many people have these thoughts all the time, and there's a continuum of thinking about it to acting on it, but it's all part of that same continuum, And we need to really, as a culture, get honest about that.
To not kind of exaggerate or freak out, because I know in the support group work that I do with the Freedom Center, people come in and we talk about suicide. We say, yeah, I'm so-and-so is suicidal, and I'm suicidal, and yeah, I have, oh, do you have a plan? Yeah. Do you have means? Yeah. That doesn't mean we call 911 right away and freak out. It's like, look, this is something that people are struggling with, and calling the authorities may not be the best solution for people. Do you think that there are situations? I mean, what I seems clear to me is that there are situations that it makes sense to be suicidal. I mean, you talked about being queer in the United States. I mean, there's so much homophobia, and we know that the suicide rate among gay youth is so much higher than among straight youth, and that's clearly a result of homophobia and oppression on the basis of sexual orientation. So it seems like suicide is often part of, there's a reason to be suicidal, and it's understandable reason.
Well, that's really true. I mean, people generally are not suicidal for no reason. You know what I mean? I mean, people face so many overwhelming odds in their lives, and it does make sense that, it's like, I just need to take myself off this planet. And I remember, trying to think through the whole screening issue, and I came up with an alternative screen where I, asked questions like, have you been abused? Do you feel like an outcast? All these things that, and I said, if you answered yes to any of these questions, like, no wonder you feel suicidal.
Yeah, Leah, maybe for listeners who maybe may not understand, can you tell us a little bit about the screening issue and what that's all about?
Well, under this whole concept, there's a suicide prevention world out there, and one of their big things is early intervention, which, sounds really great. But unfortunately, I think the methods are not that great, which tend to mainly focus on screening. So there's a whole movement to screen in the schools. They call it Teen Screen, so it's focused on high school, but there's also this initiative called Kids Screen, or they're going to screen even younger and, try and detect that way. And, that actually has been shown to have a hugely high, false positive, where, people will be kind of caught in the mental health radar. I mean, I think it's something like 85% of people who take the screen end up, positive for some kind of mental illness.
So when
it's meant to catch suicidal thoughts and behavior.
So when you say screen, you're talking about people who are given these questionnaires, and they're put through kind of tests to see whether they have mental abnormalities.
Yeah, and one of the things they are specifically screening for is suicidal thoughts and behavior. And, one thing I can say is that if you want to beat a screen, you don't want people to know you're suicidal. You can figure out how to beat a screen. And so I think it's screening is so far less than what we deserve, what young people deserve, or people of any age deserve. And I think it sort of gets back to that first of all, breaking down the silence and the shame around it. And then to really help people, it's not just about preventing someone from killing themselves. We need to give people reasons to live. And that's not the dialogue that's happening. It's all about prevention. And it's sort of like, don't bother keeping me alive if I don't have anything to live for. And so that's where I think the important work lies.
Do you think that there's a positive side, in some strange way, a positive side to having a suicidal impulse within someone, in the sense of like wanting to have something to live for?
Well, that's what I really think it is. It's sort of just this intense, it's actually sort of it's hard to describe because there's a paradox there. It's such an intense longing for life and not finding that creates such a despair that it's like it's better just to not be here. It's that intense longing for freedom, or whatever it is that the person is longing for can't be fulfilled, or for love, or to be understood, or whatever it is. So I think that's really what drives people, to consider taking their lives. And so I think it's about giving people I mean, yeah, there's huge social circumstances that we need to change. And I always say, we shouldn't be expected to adapt to a completely toxic culture. But while we're working to change that culture, what can we do to keep ourselves alive and well? Not just alive, but alive and well, despite all of the heartbreak in this world. And so that's, where I feel like we got to really be talking about wellness in a serious way, not just, about exercise or, exercise every once in a while, although exercise is great. But that's sort of like the level that people are talking about with wellness. But to just really be sharing skills, what are some things you've found that have been helpful for you when you've been feeling at your lowest? Oh, you tried that? Oh, I mean, just sort of putting those ideas out there, and these kind of things don't really get discussed. Whether it's being out in nature, or whether it's, eating, cutting out processed stuff from your diet, or really kind of taking some time to, be quiet and meditate, or whatever it is. There's no one-size-fits-all fix. But, we need to be sharing all of the skills we have.
Do you think that the kind of the suicide prevention approaches that are out there make a mistake by focusing too much on kind of like the problem individual and not looking at the larger thing of like how is the school as a whole functioning, or how is the community as a whole functioning, or the workplace as a whole functioning?
Well, right. I mean, it just is so apolitical. It's an apolitical movement, just like, psychiatry is intensely political, but pretends to be apolitical. And, I remember coming across this book called The Teenage Liberation Handbook, which was about how to, like, drop out of school and take charge of your own education. And I, was in my 20s when I found that, and I was like, God, I wish I had had something like that. I mean, because for some people, school, if it's not their family, school, just if they're an outcast, if they're queer, whatever it is, they have to go to this place every day that they feel utterly oppressed by. And, it's like if we just had the option to drop out and homeschool ourselves and do things, that's like even one option that, would probably save a lot of people from killing themselves. Just things like that, just to realize that so many people's issues are environmental, largely environmental in nature. And that families, if there's a young person who's suicidal in the family, the young person will become the scapegoat. If they go to family therapy, rather than seeing that there's interpersonal dynamics within families that are often intergenerational oppression, that's also political. Intergenerational trauma that's passed down, and not resolved, and just, the young person bears all of that. So, really I think suicide prevention needs to be much, much, much more holistic than it is right now.
Instead of just seeing the problem like, this is the person who's suicidal, rather than looking at the context.
Yeah, I mean, because we exist in environments, and we're all affected, by the environment in which we are growing up in and living in.
Yeah, I liked what you said earlier about, having something to live for. It seems to me that, an individual who is struggling with suicidal feelings because they want to have something to live for is in some ways, it's in a weird kind of way, it's almost better than someone who's just kind of, who's living but it's just like given up. I mean, we don't see people who've given up and just kind of go through day after day as some kind of problem, but we do see the people who are struggling with suicide as a problem. That's kind of backwards, I mean, there's a way in which you can kind of live a living death in life if you just sort of let go and you just say, okay, I'm just resigned to my circumstance. Whereas the suicidal impulse in some ways has a kind of a fighting spirit too. There's like an intense energy there. That's something.
Well, it is a cry. I mean, they call it a cry for help, and I agree. It's like, hey, listen to me, damn it. Look, I need people to pay attention to what's going on here, and I think that's we need those kinds of alarm bells, but at the same time, I'm not one of those people that feels so good about that idea of, well, people should have the right to take their life, I mean, I feel like it's very hard to talk about, but I don't feel like harsh coercive methods of keeping people from taking their life is the way to go. But I have a hard time standing by and just kind of saying in a sort of apathetic tone of, oh yeah, people should have the right to take their life. I think I want to actively be giving people reasons to live for.
Yeah, like a
because I am so glad that I didn't take my life. I'm horrified at times that I came very close to, successfully, quote unquote, doing that, and I'm sure that is the experience of so many other survivors of suicide attempts.
Yeah, the right to suicide just doesn't. I understand from a freedom standpoint, but it has kind of like too much of like a individualistic kind of libertarian. Like we don't care that you don't have a reason to live.
Yeah.
So you have the right to suicide. It's like the disability rights issue and euthanasia.
Right.
I'm very sympathetic to the sense of like if someone is in pain that they should be released from the pain. But on the other hand, it's like why are we as a society saying, oh, we're not going to give you a right to live. We're not going to give you a reason to live, and we're going to support your right to die. It doesn't.
Yeah.
There's something really wrong with that. Or a society. I'm thinking of the horrible film $1 Million Baby, where a young woman has a boxing injury, and then she it commits suicide with the help of her trainer because she's lost her dream. And like, well, what about supporting her to find another dream or recognizing that when you lose your dream, you're part of the human experience. We lose our dreams sometimes and we have to find other dreams rather than just saying, okay, you're a boxer and you can't box anymore. You're disabled. You're in a wheelchair. That's horrible. Being in a wheelchair and disabled is bad. So of course you want to kill yourself. There's something really, really wrong about that. And so again,
it's sort of celebrating these kind of patriarchal norms of what success is. I don't, that kind of thing where
what's normal able-bodied people,
the
dreams normal able-bodied
it is.
people.
It's very much this standard that is very kind of cookie cutter.
So Leah, if you could be the head of a counseling service at a university or a college, and you could like design this suicide prevention program, what would you design it as?
Well, first of all, I would get these dialogues going about. I can think of like a really good campaign would be like, "You're not alone," and to just have these kind of frank conversations, and to have professionals even coming out and saying that they had felt suicidal, and that. And to have people actively talking about the ways in which they've overcome that. And, to sort of take it like a sort of an activist stance on campus of, let's give people reasons to live and, don't let the world beat you down. The world needs you to survive and stay alive. And let's, fight for what we believe in, which is a better world for all people so they don't feel like they want to take themselves out. So, so they would include, campus dialogues, starting, peer support groups going for survivors, because it's the worst. It's, when you come out of that experience, it's so isolating and demeaning, and just to, I've had some, kind and compassionate people, tell me that there was hope, and coming from a perspective of having been through it themselves would have really meant so much to me. And then also to just really, talk about holistic wellness. Like wellness promotion as the best form of suicide prevention. And, the fact of the matter is that, our universities are functioning more and more in this kind of corporate way. And we need to be talking about that too, that it can be very isolating, very, not supportive of difference. And this focus on, achieve. So I think, we need to really be looking at the culture of universities and how it can sort of contribute to people feeling hopeless. And with there not being enough support systems, a lot of times, young people, the first time they're away from their family, and it's highly stressful. So I think there's just a need to like really acknowledge the environment as well in a critical way.
That's a great answer. I would add just really making sure that they're not pushing pills and the doctors are not spreading misinformation about what a diagnosis is, and
Yeah.
chemical imbalances. And it's really hard because a lot of kids, they come to school, they go away to college, and they show up and they're already on psychiatric drugs, and they've already gotten these messages that they've got a different brain and different genes. And then of course the whole society is saturated with pharmaceutical company advertising. I mean, it's not to say that the solution can come by having a really good progressive college counseling center policy. It has to be real changes in the society as a whole.
Yeah.
But I really like what you said about having the dialogues and getting these discussions to happen. When we were talking earlier, it brought up something about the people who are, if someone does commit suicide, and the people around them who are the survivors. And this actually happened to me. Someone who is pretty close to my family committed suicide several years ago, and I wasn't really close to her, but she was part of my family, and it was just a really difficult thing. And there's a part of me that it just is so much mourning for, wow, why didn't this person get more help, and they're gone now. And I kind of think of her, and I'm thinking, God, I'm not going to talk to her again, and I'm not going to see her again. It really kind of breaks my heart, and then there's a part of it too. It's like, well, wait a second, why did you do such a mean thing to us? Why did you? Because do you think that there's a way in which there's like if people are maybe feeling powerless in the world, that suicide is like their one form of power, and they can kind of express their anger through the suicide? Am I totally off in what I'm saying, or does that make any sense?
It's so hard to know, exactly what a person is experiencing at that moment. It's probably I guess I can really only speak from my own experience, but it's just this real utter despair, which is probably connected with some kind of anger. But I don't know that when you're in that state you necessarily know how it will affect others, because it's just this sense of I'm worthless and nobody will care if I'm gone type of thing, and it kind of doesn't matter. That's at least what I remember experiencing.
I know from my own, I'm just thinking about my own experiences. I mean, there have been that times when I've been really close. I mean, I have attempted suicide more than once, and I think one of the things that does help hold me here is the feeling of just I don't want to hurt the people. They're people who I really care about. I just don't know what hurt them very much. The survivors get hurt, but it is a mystery, and it isn't something that we don't really know
it's the
about.
Ultimate disconnectedness is really what it is, because I think like fundamentally we're born connected. And as we get beat down, this sense of disconnectedness gets to the point, where I think the suicidal expression is the extreme expression of that. And so, I think the fundamental question is, how do we help people feel connected again, to themselves, to each other, to this earth,
And how do we, and which is a question for all of us, because our communities are being torn apart by this capitalist, media-driven, militaristic society we live in, and we have to rebuild our communities. I mean, I just want to thank you for coming on the show and talking with us about all this and revealing so much of yourself. It's really encouraged me to reveal some things about my life too. And I, it's a hard topic, but maybe we can kind of end on a different note. And maybe if there are, anybody who's listening who's maybe struck, because I'm sure there are people who are listening who are struggling with suicide, or have a friend or a loved one who is struggling with suicide, or they've been affected by this issue in some way. What kind of message would you want to give to folks as we kind of wind up the interview here?
Just as someone who's been there, I mean, there really, really is hope out there. There are supportive organizations, that you can reach out to, like the Freedom Center and, like the Icarus Project, people who really understand that it's not your fault and that it's really this world we live in, that drives a lot of us, to feel like we want to end our lives, and that it will change. It will change, and that there's so much hope, and that the world just really, really needs you to stay alive. We need you to stay and sort of fight with us for a fight for a better world, you know, and to take that energy and to use it to make this a better place. That's really worth staying alive in, and it's within all of our power to do that.
Leah Harris, thank you so much for joining us today from Washington, D.C. on Madness Radio.
Thank you for having me, Will.
You've been listening to an interview with Leah Harris. Leah Harris is an activist, writer, and advocate who works with the National Association for Rights Protection and Advocacy and has written for a number of publications, including Off Our Backs, Adbusters.org, and Street Spirit. That's about all the time we have this week. Thanks a lot for tuning in to Madness Radio. You've been listening to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health. Madness Radio is broadcast every Wednesday, 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Pacifica affiliate WXOJ-LP-FM 103.3 Valley Free Radio in Northampton, Massachusetts. For our live internet stream, podcasting, show archives, and more, visit madnessradio.net. Madness Radio is co-produced by Freedom Center and the Icarus Project. For more information, check out freedom-center.org and theicarusproject.net. For more mental health radio, listen to the News Hour from mindfreedom.org, Wednesdays, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you have an idea for a story or guest on Madness Radio, or you just want to share what's in your head, contact us at radio@madnessradio.net.
KWMD Kasilov 90.7, Anchorage 104.5.